So the first thing we got to knock out is moving everything that we're not going to keep or that's in the way. So you're going to take out your factory battery, make sure to disconnect everything before you get started, take out the battery tray, also remove your intake and the factory airbox tray. Make sure everything's out of the way to give you as much working room as possible. Once you have the intake and everything out of the way, you're going to start disconnecting the two plugs that the factory battery harness connect to. There's a white and a black plug, as well as disconnecting the grounds from the piece of the frame where you can see me unbolting things. Do not throw out the hardware. You're going to reuse that to reground to the frame. And then after you've already disconnected all that and disconnected the plug on the side of the AC compressor, you're going to go ahead and disconnect the plug right here on the side of the fuse or top of the fuse box. And after you disconnect that plug at the top of the fuse box, you're going to go ahead and undo the two wires that are connected at the top of the fuse box as well, so that you can proceed with removing the factory battery wiring harness. So you can see I'm just finishing undoing that, setting everything aside. And then what I'm going to go ahead and do is I'm going to make sure there's nothing kind of snagged up holding it in place, and I'm going to come around to disconnect the 13mm nut on the alternator that holds the alternator wire down. After you've disconnected your alternator wire and you're sure that it's not snagged anywhere at the AC compressor, alternator, or forward where everything we've already disconnected, we're going to move under the car. So down here on the driver's side towards the bottom of the engine near the oil pan, there's two bolts. One is a drain for the coolant. The other one that I'm undoing is a ground for the engine bay. We're going to move back to the starter, undo the starter plug, and we are going to also undo the starter bolt that holds that in place. That's also a 13mm. And then we'll go back up to the engine bay and we'll be able to pull everything just right out carefully, making sure not to get caught and damage the harness anywhere. You'll carefully lift it up and out. So with a little bit of patience and some determination, you're able to just easily remove the factory battery wiring harness out from the vehicle. And I just went ahead and I got a chair and I got a sharp knife, and I just got started with unwrapping and unraveling everything from the factory battery wiring harness. So there was a lot of background noise, but this one wire I'm holding up actually came off as one of the grounds for the battery wiring harness. You notice the white plug, it is the ground, and we're going to reuse this cable to go ahead and re-ground the electric power steering back to the frame when we go ahead and put everything back together. So do not discard, damage, or modify this cable in any way. So once I had that one cable set aside, I just continued on, just taking off the tape and the plastic, just unraveling everything. That way I can get these wires cleaned up and readjusted for the battery relocation and cleaning everything up inside the engine bay. So I slowed it down right here so you can see the pace that I'm going. I'm just going at a nice slow steady pace, and at this point I actually got the ground wires out from being wrapped up with everything else in the system, and these are actually taken, put aside, and these ground wires that I took out would not be reused.
Shoo.
That's gone.
You're going to the repoop, buddy.
That'll be a good wire for it. It's not bad. It's just no longer needed. So
So I just went ahead and finished up removing some of the excess old material, getting everything all cleaned up and prepared for me to go ahead and readjust and rewrap everything when I put it back together. So the next thing I went ahead and took care of was just using a 10mm. I removed the factory battery positive terminal that had the integrated 60 amp electric power steering fuse, as that's also not going to be reused for this relocation. So I just unbolted it right there on the side, and that whole piece just comes completely off and is separated. So after successfully removing the factory battery positive terminal with the integrated 60 amp fuse, I just cleaned it up a little bit, and I grabbed two pliers and I went ahead and I bent the eyelet that was inside of it to a 90-degree angle. This eyelet is going to be now the eyelet that goes to your fuse box and supplies your fuse box with positive power. At this point, I'd also finished removing all of the tape and plastic from the factory wiring and was just finishing cleaning up any little straggler remnant pieces to clean everything up nice and neat and get it ready for rewrapping nice and looking good to be reinstalled back into the car.
When you go to rewrap the harness after you've taken everything apart, this is what you need to pay attention to. So the thick wire from the main harness that went to the original battery positive, we took that, bent a 90-degree angle on that. This is going to be the starting point. The wire, the white wire for the alternator power, we went ahead and we zip tied them together. From here, take the wire or the plug that goes into the fuse box, zip tie all these together at the same spot, and give us about a 5-inch lead. The wire that comes off of the old battery positive that goes to the fuse box, now just ignore this wire, and then we're going to go from this zip tie, let's say this is the starting point, we're going to measure out 20 inches. And at 20 inches, we're going to zip tie two things. We're going to put about 4-inch lead, and this is for the AC compressor, and then we're going to do, for the alternator, this is where it's going to come out on this side, and we're going to make it 19 inches, okay? The slack, all of the slack from the blue wire, from this black and yellow, from the extra for the alternator, all of that, we're just going to fold it up nice and neat, and that's going to get wrapped up inside of the harness, so that way you don't have to worry about it, you don't have to cut anything shorter. And then, so this is the whole thing. Fuse box, 5 inches for the fuse box. Ignore this piece hanging down, 20 inches. AC compressor, alternator, and then tie up the extra nice and neat to the starter.
Hey man, I get you.
So, for these wires, went ahead and opened up the harness where you find the wiring for the fans, and the reason why I did that is to pull the positive and negative for the electric power steering and be able to wire them separately. So you'll just carefully open up the harness right here that runs down by the radiator fans, and we're just going to use some tape and rewrap it back up, knowing that we're going to have only the fans now in that part of the harness. And the electric power steering wires, we're actually just going to have them come up over here, and we'll have them tied out the way and also installed. I'm going to splice this clip into the video where I just originally put the ground. So if you don't have the factory air box or tray or anything, and let's say you just have it like this, you don't have an aftermarket tray or something like that.
Even the factory box.
Even the factory box. This point is actually the mount point for the tray. This point right here and this point right here. So you're either going to have to A, put it on the top as long as it's metal and it'll like go through, which isn't ideal, or B, just ground it back to where it was at. Just follow this whole section and just have it tied in place, and it all reaches because we have more than enough slack. We didn't cut anything shorter, so it's good obviously that we left that slack and didn't cut it impulsively. But ground here, run around, you're fine. We can put this tray back on, and here is of course where the fuse is mounted. So what we're gonna do is this plug right here. This is gonna be hard to watch, but we're going to cut the end. There it is. You'll kind of use a rule of thumb of the new piece, and you're not going to want to cut the insulation all the way back because you don't want a bunch of extra exposed, but you need at least enough in there. So what I like to do is up until it goes up to the body, till almost the end of that brass, you'll kind of match that and take off about that much insulation. Now that that part of the wire is exposed, what we're going to do is first we need to put the end of our fuse in place. So we'll put the plastic, we'll put the seal, just kind of get that in place and ready. You're going to get your fuse and make sure, you see there's a set screw which kind of holds everything together. Open that up. So you'll see that that's opened up and ready to accept the strands of the end of the wire. You're going to carefully feed it in place. Just make sure you tighten it up real good. There. That's nice tightened up. And now we're gonna close up this end and seal it. So yeah, that'll be mounted right there. And just so people can see, we're putting it here for the sake of the install so you can see how I would normally do it. Dean's actually going to make some extra wire because he's going to do a more custom setup. But typically with my kit, you would get the fuse mounted right here. And what you do is you'd lift with the little tabs, pop open the top half of the fuse box so that, this stuff's out of the way. And then when you put the holes through, with the hardware that I included in the kit to hold the fuse here, and then over here you'll be able to make sure obviously that you don't line up with this piece that holds the clip in, and you just put the through bolts and you just can tighten it up and everything, and then there you go, your fuse is held in place right there. This is probably a step that you'll want to do before you connect the wires at the top of the fuse box, just because it will give you a little bit more wiggle room. But if you do this part first and you don't want to undo it, you can do it with it connected. It'd just probably be a little bit easier if you do the fuse mounting first and then connect the wires.
So in this part of the video, I'm just feeding the power harness back into place, connecting it back at the alternator and AC compressor, and just kind of routing it into the engine bay on the opposite side of the AC lines, just so it's, kept out and to the side, and just reconnecting, bolting everything back up.
Right now, I'm on the driver's side of the car in the wheel well, and I'm just going to point out. So this is where we're going to install one of two of the engine bay grounds, and the 2 points that we're going to be installing at is going to be right here at this point for the engine mount or motor mount, and then at that leading bottom lug for the mount bracket for the motor. So that's the one for the motor is a 17, right here is a 14 millimeter, and I'm just going to undo those one at a time, and I'm going to get the ground wire put in, and then I'm going to come back on camera and I'm going to show you what that looks like installed. So now that you can see, I got one side to the motor and the other side to the motor mount. But that bridges the gap. Normally, the motor mount itself will also act as like a conductivity isolator, just because it's meant to. It's not a solid mount. But by doing this, you bridge that gap between the subframe and the engine itself, and so that you can have a nice solid connection. And there's two of these grounds. I'll put the one on the passenger side now. So I'm going to get ready to tighten it up right now, but here is the passenger side ground. It goes to that bottom forward leading mount bracket point, and then comes up here to the motor mount. And yeah. I'd just like to point out a very important part of this install. For the wire that goes from the starter to the 200 amp, one side is 3/8 to the starter, and the other is 1/4 that's going to go to the 200 amp fuse. So you have to make sure that when you're feeding this wire through, you put the right side to go to the starter. Otherwise you're going to have to take it back out, switch it around, and put it back. So this is the side that goes to the starter, and this is the plug. So we're going to feed it down through like that, and then we're going to get ready to feed it down underneath the car, and we're going to kind of get everything kind of set in place and make sure that there's no slack under the car, and then we'll make sure to pull the slack up into the car. And once there's no slack underneath and everything's set inside, then we'll go and we'll get the fuse and everything put into place. So I'm going to do that now. Now that we have the wire down underneath, all secured in place like I showed in one of the previous videos, I'm going to go ahead and get this side, which is going to fortunately have a little bit of slack as well. I'm going to get this all in place, and then that way we can start getting the fuse mounted inside the trunk itself. So right behind here in this rear part of the interior panel, behind the back seat, between the door and the back seat, we're just going to kind of tuck this back there just so that it's, you know, in the open cavity where the wire harness goes through for the car, as opposed to behind the back seat itself.
So I placed the 200 amp fuse on the top right with a little bit of space of this left back seat panel, and I just go ahead and I drill a hole through it so that I can have that as my starting point for the first bolt that's going to come through to mount that 200 amp fuse. So then I just go and I included 2 bolts and 2 nuts specifically for mounting the 200 amp fuse, and I get that hardware out so that I can go ahead and get the first corner of that 200 amp fuse mounted. And what I do is I take the bolts and I have the bolts go through from inside of the car, sticking into the trunk area, because that actually makes mounting the fuse dramatically easier, especially if you're doing this as a one-person job. So I'll just have that come through into the trunk area, and I'll come back around and I will mount the 200 amp fuse on that first corner that I drilled through. And once I've finished securing that first corner of the fuse with that 10mm nut, I will go ahead and drill the second hole so that way I can put the second bolt through from inside the car and have it come into the trunk area where I can finish securing the 200 amp fuse. So I'm going to go ahead and start drilling that second hole right here, and I'll pop straight through, and then that's when I'll come around and I'll mount I'll put in place the second bolt.
Yeah, that's good. And then so what I can do is just tighten it up real quick. I want to say.
And right here, I'm just taking off the 10mm nut that will go on the 200 amp from the line that's going and coming into the trunk area after it comes through from underneath the car, and just securing that in place really quick.
There. So now that's wired in, and now it's just running where the positive and the grounds are going to go. But I'm going to pop that fuse. Just make sure it's open right now. But that's that.
So at this point of the install, I have my wires ran, I have the 200 amp fuse mounted in place, so I just went ahead and I put the interior back together, putting that back seat back in place with the seat bottom.
Okay. So GoPro died real quick, we're back over here. So for the ground wire, we have one 3/8 side, it's going up here to the strut tower. The other 3/8 side goes over here, and I used drill mounted brush and cleaned the spot off before I put this over here. There's already a nut welted from the factory on the back end, so I was just putting this in place and tightening it up. And this will be for the 2 grounds that go to the battery negative. And real quick, let's see if I can manage to get this. So when you get up under here and you look around, okay, over there is where we're going to be starting at, and we're going to run right up to one of these holes, and we're going to pass through. Inside of here, you kind of can't really, let me see if I can get a view of it. Hard to see, but there's a hole that goes through the 2 halves of this beam, and you're going to feed it through, and you're going to come through and around, and you're going to pop out on the inside over here behind the carpet already, and it's going to come forward, and we're going to connect it down over to the starter positive, or to the battery positive. So I'm just going to run that real quick. Come down around this side, and it'll come out, and we'll connect to our positive. Right about this part of the arch, we'll get about right here, which is corresponds with about right here. You just use like a razor blade or pocket knife or something and put like a little cross sign just to be able to feed the wires through. On the back, there's actually spacing through the factory insulation where you can fit the wires right through there as well.
So a quick little bit of advice that I found out after doing this part is that if you take off some of that insulation around where you made that hole, it won't get drawn through when you draw the wires through, and so it won't look kind of ugly with those insulation getting pulled through.
That was easy.
So the part of the video that I had made at Dean's house for installing the tray itself had gotten corrupted, so we're going to use my car now that it's back from the body shop to install the tray. So the first thing you're going to need to do is, once everything's out of the way, you're going to need to pull back the carpet, fold it over, and you want to remove the insulation right here because it's going to clog up the drill bit, and it's going to also make installing the tray more difficult. So I'm going to go ahead and put the camera down in this spot, and then I'm going to get the step drill bit out that I need in order to drill the hole in the trunk, along with a Sharpie and a couple of other small tools.
So I'll set the box in place where I want it. Let's say I'll put it right about here, okay? And once I have it in place where I'm going to drill into the trunk, I'll use a Sharpie and I'll mark the holes where they're going to go through on the bottom half of the box so that I can drill through.
So once I have the 4 holes marked, I use a step drill bit. I personally drill the holes out to a 1/2 inch, and that way I have a little bit of room that I can kind of move the box around and make sure that everything gets lined up, and it just kind of makes installing the bracket from underneath the car that much easier. So this is the part where I went ahead and I removed the deadening material underneath the carpet where the battery box is going to be, just to make things a little bit easier to install. And at this point is also when I went ahead and I used a flathead screwdriver, and I just felt for where the holes are at, and I punched holes through the carpet at the same points where the holes are in the trunk floor, so that I can get the hardware to go through the carpet.
And what I'll go ahead and do next is I will take the hardware that I have and I'll push it through the bottom so it's kind of in place, and push that through the holes in the trunk floor. You can see that the box is in with the hardware through, and the hardware is actually sticking out through the bottom. So now we'll go under the car so you can see it sticking out through the bottom.
So underneath the car you can see the 4 bolts sticking through, and so if you have someone helping you, what you can do is you can kind of just hold the plate up underneath and get the bolts lined up, help them kind of get seated at the beginning of the threads, and the person from inside the trunk can start to fasten everything, tighten everything down, get everything all lined up. I myself did not have someone helping me when I did this, unlike when I had Dean helping me. So what I ended up actually doing, and with my exhaust out of the way, you can see here I used one hand and I kind of held through the exhaust shroud area the plate up in place, and then I'm going to reposition the camera so you can see, but I actually had one arm reaching into the car with a driver so that I could tighten it up myself. I had the first thread started here, and then I went ahead and I repositioned the camera, and you can see I go ahead and I get all 4 of them eventually, with some effort and a little bit of sweat. I got the threads started on all 4 corners so that way from inside the trunk area I can just go ahead and get everything tightened up. But the critical part is just making sure you get them started threaded without cross threading. So back in the trunk, I went ahead from my screwdriver set. I grabbed a bit that is the right size hex head for the bolts, and I just went ahead and one by one went and tightened up all 4 bolts so everything's nice and snug. With all 4 bolts tightened up, I went ahead and I placed my battery down in place inside of the tray. And now from the battery box hardware stuff, I went ahead and I grabbed the studs for tying down the battery, and I got them threaded all the way through till the first couple of threads was sticking down out of the bottom of the nut that is welded onto the side of the battery box. And once I had both sides, both of the studs installed, I went ahead and I grabbed the tie down bar and got that all fastened down, making sure to put the bar, then the lock washers with the wing nuts finally on top. And so that would conclude the installation of the battery box and tray part of the video. So you'll just go ahead and make sure to get your carpets reinstalled, carefully reconnect all your wiring, and then that is it. You are done with the relocation of your battery into the trunk of your car. Congratulations.